Tonight, we're taking a chance as we tap into our spiritual side. Anybody know what their spiritual side is? That's good. I am not talking about religion. I am not talking about religion. I am a Christian. That is my faith. I'm not asking you to be a Christian. If you want to be one, I can show you how. But it is not required. I have respect for all faiths. All faiths. But what I'm talking about is not faith or religion. I'm talking about spirituality. So I want to get clear on what I mean by that. It means, my definition is living your life with an open heart through love. What's the difference between religion and spirituality, or is there a difference?
Well, some say that religions, people don't want to go to hell, and spirituality, people who've been to hell already. Religion should be the structures, the prayer tables, the things that you do in the course. It should help you, it should cultivate, it should be the practices, it should be the symbols, it should be the rituals that cultivate your sense that there's more.
This is week 2 of our series, Spiritual But Not Religious, and I do want to say, received a lot of positive feedback after last Sunday, which is meaningful to me more than usual because, I've been honest in this series. I've always tried to be honest since we started One Church, but last week was a bit of a challenge for me. And I know that, as we do get honest about our spiritual lives and about our religious experiences and our beliefs and our views, and that can be challenging to some people. There's some folks who aren't ready for that kind of honesty. There are folks who aren't ready to be honest with themselves. So they don't want to see other people be honest, you know what I mean? Because that kind of puts pressure on them. And I really appreciate your feedback after last week when we began this series. And during this series where we are exploring what an authentic spirituality can look like in our lives. You may have been raised in a very religious home. You may have been raised with no religion. So you have different challenges coming from those different experiences. But we're exploring what an authentic spiritual life might look like here in the 21st century, when a growing number of people are describing themselves as spiritual but not religious, and that's where this title comes from. Somewhere around 20% of Americans would say that they're kind of leaving religion behind, and they're still though they're having a longing for some kind of connection with the spiritual, greater things, the meaning of life, things that matter, goodness, beauty, truth, mercy, compassion, love, and purpose. But in their experience, they believe that the religious systems they've seen have not been particularly helpful to help them curate their own spiritual life and put them in touch with those things. In fact, in their experience, perhaps religion has actually built barriers that's made it more difficult for them to have meaningful spiritual experiences. And so there are people who are disappointed with organized religion. And they're just saying, if these Christians in the media, if that's what it means to be a Christian, no thank you. Or maybe they know people, even worse yet, who have treated them like they have targets on their back, and they're trying to convert them, and they're treating them like they have an agenda for their lives. It's like God has a wonderful plan for your life, and I'm going to tell you exactly what that is. And they've had interaction with people like that, and they're just I don't find that life-giving. I don't find it inspiring. I don't find it helpful. And so there are folks who are beginning to call themselves spiritual but not religious. Now, there are skeptical people, just like we said last week, who would probably think this is just hype. It's some other kind of sales pitch, because there are churches that do that, the bait and switch, kind of market, the series, market the concept, and then it's really just the same old thing dressed up in a new, wrapping paper and bow. This is a different kind of church than what you're going to encounter most of the time in the Southeast Valley, first of all. But we're looking at the Gospel of John, one of the 4 Gospels in the New Testament, kind of biographies of Jesus. And we're discovering that the central plot line in all 4 of the Gospels, whether you believe this or not, you're going to find out it's true, and I'm going to invite you to read through it on your own, which you could do in like an hour. And you'll see that the central plot line of Jesus' life is his struggle to live out what he sees as an authentic spiritual life in an atmosphere of great religious division in a time when the religious system he encountered seemed really good at building barriers and separating groups of people, and in his opinion, separating people from God, actually separating the people from the God they claimed they were leading them to. And so Jesus had pretty stern criticism for people who perpetuated religious systems that he thought were just bad religion. And that's the central plot line in all four Gospels. That is the central theme of Jesus' life. And there are people who be like, I don't buy it. I invite you to read it for yourself. If you're reading through the Gospel of John, we're going to talk about chapters 4 and 5 this week, and we're going to kind of hit highlights, but I invite you to read it for yourself and see. Like, oh my gosh, if you call yourself spiritual but not religious, you might identify more than you're comfortable identifying with Jesus. You're like, oh, geez, I kind of like that Jesus guy. I'm not sure if I like that or not. If you're kind of a skeptical person, because you're going to find that you probably have a lot in common if that's how you feel. So that's where we're headed in this series, and today we're going to look at two people, a man and a woman, who both of them carried pain, shame, a sense of isolation, and here's the really important part. That pain and shame and isolation had a lot to do with the religious systems in which they lived. The religion was not helping them to overcome pain and shame and isolation. In fact, the religious system was perhaps causing their pain and their shame and their isolation. And both of these people have an encounter with Jesus. And the Gospel of John has been called a spiritual gospel since the early 100s AD. And the author of the Gospel of John seems to be saying that there is an authentic kind of life-giving, vital, dynamic spirituality that it can be found in Jesus. And it's different from the religious systems that we encounter as Christians or throughout history then and now. And so Jesus crosses paths with these people, and they both experience a kind of healing, a kind of hope, joy that the religious systems of their day were not providing to them. So we're going to read their stories, and I'm going to kind of cram a bunch of information in quickly. And then the second half of my talk today is going to be a TED Talk. I actually had about 40 minutes of material, believe it or not, even with the birth of the baby. And I was trying to edit this TED Talk and figure out which part to show you. And I was like, I'm going to show the whole thing. So I pared down my portion, and then the last half of my talk today is going to be this TED Talk called The Power of Vulnerability. If you've seen it before, you know how great it is. This is going to be my fourth time. So we're going to read through some episodes, this woman and this man in John chapter 4 and chapter 5. We're going to talk a little bit about what it might mean for us if you consider yourself spiritual but not religious. And then we're looking at kind of forming a customized spiritual path for you. And we're going to continue that next week as well. But as you learn about this man and this woman, as you watch the TED Talk, I want to encourage you to think about, how does this apply to my life? How does this speak to my life? Like specifically, in your own life experiences that are unique. How does the woman's story, the man's story in the TED Talk apply to your life, and how could it kind of provide a customized spiritual path for you to curate your own spiritual life? Sound good? All right, so we're going to dive in. Here's John chapter 4. Right before we read it, we need to say that Jews and Samaritans did not associate with one another in the land of Israel in Jesus' time. One of my best friends is a Jewish rabbi. I'm always cautious about the language in the Gospels, the Jews or whatever. This is a specific group of religious leaders. It certainly does not mean all Jewish people. Jesus was Jewish. But Jews and Samaritans did not associate with one another. If somebody was traveling from the Galilee, which is the north part of Israel, to Judea, which is the south part of Israel, well, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, but in between them was a region called Samaria. And you would say, well, if I'm going to go from Galilee to Judea, I just walk through Samaria. But that's not how it worked. They didn't associate. So if either group were going to travel, they would go around. A Jew would go around Samaria, take the long way, the scenic route, around Samaria. Because there are barriers. We don't associate with them. They don't associate with us. We don't like each other. So let's read John chapter 4. Now Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that he was gaining, a very religious minority group, had heard that he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. So he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. He's going from the south to the north. Watch. Now he had to go through Samaria. Wait a second. He had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph, an Old Testament allusion there. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans." Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water, water that moves, water that has life." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and livestock?" Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." He told her, Go call your husband and come back." "I have no husband," she replied. This is the ancient world, right? Jesus said to her, "You're right when you say that you have no husband. The fact is, you have had 5, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true." "Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain," because the Samaritans worship on a different mountain than the Jews. It's a different religion. "But you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." Woman, which is not a disrespectful term in this culture. Ma'am, miss. "Believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and they that worship him," that was the old translation, "and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth." The woman said, "I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us." Then Jesus declared, "I, the one speaking to you, am he." So he had to go through Samaria. There was a sharp barrier between Jews and Samaritans, but he had to go through Samaria. The pop religion of his time taught him that you have to avoid Samaritans. We need to build a wall. Right? You guys get that? Okay, great. We can't cross the wall. You can't go through Samaria because we need to be separated from these people. And the Gospel of John says he had to go through Samaria. He sits down and he at this well, and he strikes up a conversation with this woman. He's already crossed a geographic barrier, but that geographic barrier is there because there's a religious barrier. The Samaritans and Jews practiced a different religion. And so he's crossed a religious barrier. And then he sits down and he starts talking to a Samaritan woman, which in the ancient world, for a man to talk to a woman in public was viewed as a little suspect. There's a social barrier that he crosses there. So he's crossing several social barriers in this act to talk to this Samaritan woman. And he has a conversation with her that, you have to know the backstory to understand why it progresses the way it does. It gets deep quickly, and why it ends where it does. She has 5 husbands. She's had 5 husbands. Woman did not divorce her husband. She's been put away 5 times. A man has said to her, "Go away," 5 times. And the man that she's with now is keeping her as a mistress. She is feeling social shame. Noon is not when you came to draw water when it was hot. She's coming when no other women, and it was a woman's job in the ancient world to do this. No other women were around when she came to draw water. She's a woman who's lonely. She's a woman who feels shame from religious people and the people in her culture who had their kind of pop religion cultural norms. And so the fact that Jesus would ask her a question, will you do a favor for me? It's kind of like humbling himself to her. And he's talking to her in public, which a man would not normally do. And then he knows some things about her life. And then they have a spiritual discussion because she's kind of probing, who are you? What are you getting at here? And things get deep pretty quickly. And he has such an effect on his life, her life, the fact that he's crossed all these social barriers has such a profound effect on her life that she starts to think, I've heard that somebody will come who will stand for goodness and can break down barriers and stand for compassion and fairness and rightness and beauty and goodness and truth and mercy and love and compassion. And I kind of feel that right now. And so I'm just going to go ahead and kind of bring that up. And he says, I am he. And then later in the chapter, she goes around to the people she knows. He's had such a profound effect on her that she goes around and starts saying to people, could this be the one? Because that's not normal. For somebody to crash through all these barriers that he had to crash through to talk to me and have a positive effect on my life. We live in a time of great barriers. I don't need to tell you that. And, if I'm offending somebody by dropping my wall joke, apologies. But, we live in a very divided time. We live in a time in which I have Muslim friends who are a little freaked out because we talked about building a database to keep Muslims in. And here in this little church in the Southeast Valley of Phoenix, we're surrounded by people who are huddling up together and wanting to build barriers and make sure that we're in and other people are out, and we're in a time of a culture war in religion and politics, and we know all about that. We're in a time of great wall building and barrier building. Perhaps what John is saying here is that bad religion, unhealthy religion, can often build barriers between people, but an authentic spirituality pulls barriers down. That's extremely important for people who want to follow Jesus here in the 21st century United States in a time of great barriers. An authentic spirituality, a Jesus-inspired spirituality, seeks to pull barriers down. So I'm privileged to have conversations every week with people who are looking for a spiritual life. And I just have amazing conversations every single week. And I've found in my conversations with people over the years that when it comes to religion and spirituality, there are basically two kinds of people. And I know that sounds reductionistic, and maybe it is, and maybe I'm painting with too broad of a brush, and you can disagree. But in my experience, I've found that there are two kinds of people when it comes to religion and spirituality. There are people who are open, and there are people who are closed. There are people who are open to new ideas and questions, and maybe they don't have it all right. Maybe they don't have it all figured out. Maybe Pastor Bob didn't know everything, the pastor that influenced them earlier in life. And maybe everything they've been told isn't right. And there are people who are open to that, and there are people who are close to that. There are people who say, I believe what I believe because I believe it, and that's why I believe it. And I believe it no matter what the facts say. And they kind of go through life like this, with arms crossed. And when they encounter anybody different, or any challenging idea, or when they see Oprah, because that somehow is a threat in some way to their assurance, their certitude. And so I've encountered people who are open, and I've encountered people who are closed. And I worked with a pastor 20 years ago. It's probably the first time, well, not the first time, but early on, when I encountered a kind of mentality and started to get insight into what's really going on in this. And maybe you can identify with this in your own spiritual life, whatever your journey has been. And we were talking one day, just kind of small talk, because we were working in the same office, and it's kind of fuzzy, but I think he read a newspaper article, or that was about that time where there was this new thing called the internet. So it was probably a real live newspaper made out of paper, And maybe he read an article, and tragically, a couple of children, I think, had been killed in an accident. And he had a couple of kids at that time. And he said, oh man, these kids were killed in an accident. And I said, it's terrible. And he said something like, that's why I pray for my kids every day. Well, that's good. I was like 20 years old, I don't know, something like that. And that's great. And I said, so, does your prayer for your children guarantee that nothing, I kind of pushed a little bit, nothing painful is ever going to happen to your kids? And he said, well, God doesn't answer everybody's prayers. He said, if you're a born-again Christian living in the will of God, God hears your prayers. If you're not, then he doesn't. And so I said, okay, so, does that mean that every time there's an accident, somebody gets hurt or killed or a child dies, their parents didn't pray for them, or their parents weren't Christians who had faith and prayed for them, and check this out. There was a change on his face. And he said, God's not going to let anything happen to my kids. Hey, you have those experiences? We're like, oh, hey, Darth Vader just came out. Or hey, whoa, I just pushed a button. I just stepped in a pile of something there. And, oh, okay. And I said, really, man, if you pray for your kids, nothing bad's ever going to happen to them. If something bad happens to kids, their parents didn't pray enough or they weren't Christians or something like that. And he was, oh yeah, big time. And that was the beginning of a realization for me that, going back to there are people who are open and there are people who are closed. The people who are closed, in my view, are not closed for religious reasons. They're closed for personal reasons. And in that reaction, he couldn't mask it any longer. There was a reaction that I fully understand, but one of fear. Of course, nobody wants anything painful to happen to their children. You guys follow me? Right? Of course nobody wants anything bad to happen to their kids. Of course. Nobody does. And so his answer to that fear was, well, if I pray, God won't let anything happen to my kids. I don't have to be afraid anymore. Whew. Isn't it great how that works? Oh, it's magic. So cool. It's just like a transaction. I prayed, God protects my kids. Cool. We're square, right? Nice. And now that kind of religion and spirituality, I guess, gets you through the night. It's awesome. Until when? Something painful happens. And then that kind of spirituality is worthless because it didn't work. It fell apart, didn't promise what it said it was going to deliver. Imagine the barrier between him as a pastor and somebody in his congregation who lost a child or went through some really painful experience. Imagine that barrier. So now not only have I suffered that grief, but now my pastor thinks I just wasn't, I wasn't living in God's will. God didn't hear my prayer, or I didn't pray for my kids. Imagine the kind of barrier that kind of religious system causes. One that's based on impossible certainty. First of all, nowhere in this very large collection of books does it ever promise that if you pray for things, God is obligated to answer your prayer. Nowhere does the Bible say that. He got that idea from somewhere else, not the Bible. And I think it came from his fear, that his religious system was like a self-medicated, or an attempt to self-medicate his fear. And that creates all kinds of barriers. And now, he wasn't a terrorist, right? So I want to be fair. But at its core, that kind of smug, arrogant certainty, in capital letters, that God's going to do what I want God to do, and I know it, and I believe it, and that settles it, and there's no question about it, and I'm not willing to tolerate any kind of questions. That same kind of smug arrogance that led him to say that is the same kind of arrogance that leads to people putting suicide vests on and detonating them in crowds, or flying airplanes into buildings, or shooting up a concert hall in Paris, or shooting up a mental health center in San Bernardino. That same kind of smug arrogance is responsible for the religious conflict we see in our world. I'm right, you're wrong, I know it, you don't, I'm certain, end of story. And then there's like a devaluing and a demonization of other people. And so it seems that John is saying an authentic spirituality breaks down barriers. It comes from a sense of openness, and it breaks down barriers that this kind of religious certitude can cause. Maybe you can identify with what I'm saying in your life story, your spiritual journey. Maybe not. If you're the kind of person who says, I'm looking for something more. That religious system of certitude is not working for me. I've had questions about it forever. I've never gotten good answers. I want to toss out a couple of resources to you. And one of them is going to be on the screen, but the other one won't. Maybe you can write it down if you keep notes. One of them is a movement in our world called interspirituality, which of course would freak out some of the people I was raised with. But it's an idea that at the core, there is some truth, something to learn from all religions, or even philosophy that's secular. At its core, perhaps there is something good we can learn from each faith or secular philosophy. And so if you want to Google this, interspirituality, and then one of the experts is Karen Armstrong, Karen, Karen Armstrong, interspirituality. You could Google that, and you could have yourself a heyday. If you're not an NFL fan, that's something for you to do this afternoon. Karen Armstrong, interspirituality. And that could lead you down, a path of discovery that could really speak to you. I think it'd be life-giving to you. Another one is this: when it comes to how we respond to violence or violent beliefs or words that build barriers. Of course, tomorrow is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and he has something to say about breaking down barriers and responding with love and nonviolence, even when we feel like somebody else is trying to erect a barrier, and keep us out. And so I've recommended, this book before, but it's a book by MLK. It's a collection of his sermons called Strength to Love. And the point is that some people think love is weakness. When you're hurt, or when somebody tries to build a barrier, or they've disappointed you, or they've hurt you in some way, whether it's religion or not, something else, it actually requires strength to choose to love. To choose to respond with love is actually a powerful choice. And one of the best books I've ever read in my life. I really mean that. Strength to Love, Martin Luther King Jr. And so bad religion can often build barriers between people, but an authentic spirituality pulls barriers down. We see it in chapter 5 as well. We will speed through this one a little bit quicker. Jesus encounters a man who's been physically disabled for 38 years. And he meets him next to this pool. It's called the Pool of Bethesda. And in the ancient world, there were pools all over the empire, the Roman Empire, the world, that maybe had kind of a geyser-like quality, a spring source, and the water would bubble up every once in a while. And there was a belief, kind of the widespread pop religious belief, that these pools were healing pools. And people who were blind or paralyzed or whatever could get into the water, and they believed the water had healing properties. And so this man laid next to this Pool of Bethesda for who knows how long. And he was waiting. When the waters would bubble up, he would try to get into the pool, but somebody else would always get in before him. And this was just kind of accepted in the ancient world. This is a pop religious way of experiencing healing. So let's read John chapter 5. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there was in Jerusalem near the Sheep Gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie: the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred." He's alone. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me. He loses the race to get to the healing pool. The religion's not working for him. Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. This was presented as a healing miracle, which of course Jesus is known for. We say here, questions and doubts welcome, right? So you have your questions about that. But in the Gospel of John, what this means to us is John is saying to us, an authentic spirituality heals the vulnerable in a way that commonly accepted religious practices cannot. We've seen that before in John with the water that's turned into wine, and now this pool, the man can't get there. This pop religious way of seeking healing is not working for him. And so he's been there for who knows how long, but Jesus encounters him, and Jesus offers healing to him that the Pool of Bethesda did not. And we know now, some hot water is not going to do a whole lot for you if you're paralyzed or if you're blind. So we know it didn't work. And that was true of this man. I've prayed for lots of people to be healed who weren't healed. Now there are times when people have prayed, and man, amazing things have happened. And you're thankful for those. And there are lots of times when, okay, we have to assume something else was happening, hopefully for the better. Right? So there are some forms of religion maybe you were raised in where people just assumed we're going to pray and that's the way it's going to be done, and maybe that led to a crisis of faith for you. Or maybe it was, again, back to certitude and it just didn't work for you. But here's something I've experienced in my own life that has led people to healing and wholeness in all kinds of ways, and I'm certainly a work in progress. But if your experience of religion has been that it's not been particularly helpful to you, I have experienced a form of spirituality that's been helpful to me. And it looks something like this. When the man at the Pool of Bethesda trusted Jesus enough to pick up his mat and walk, there were some things that went through his mind that led to that decision. You may not think about it as you read the text, but there are some things that certainly he had to think about and make decisions about. Jesus asked him one, "Do you want to get well?" The guy wanted to get well. He wasn't happy in his comfort zone of sickness. He was willing to branch out and do whatever it took. He didn't give up in his search for healing. Maybe some of us are discouraged and you want to give up. And you think, well, maybe there is no joy for me. Maybe there is no healing for me. Maybe my pain from the past is too great. and I can't get past it. I can't get over it. The religious experience I've had is just too powerful of a trigger, and it leads me back to this big pile of stuff that we talked about last week, and I just can't get past it. Jesus might compassionately look at you and ask, do you want to get well? And this man decided, yeah, I really do. I want to get well. And he had some other decisions that he had to make. One was, do you believe that you're even worthy of getting well? Because this man lived in shame and probably a sense of, I got way louder there, didn't I, when I moved that mic? Sorry about that. This sense of unworthiness. He's been sick a really long time. And in the ancient world, that was certainly a barrier between him and his society. There were some people who avoided people who were physically disabled because they thought it could rub off on them. So this man was viewed by some as just lower than low. People who would walk around him. And he had nobody to help him into the water. This is an isolated man who had felt the crushing weight of shame and unworthiness, messages of unworthiness from his culture. He had to believe, hey, this man, by telling me to get up and walk, is acknowledging that I can do something. He's already broken the barrier. He's talking to me. Maybe he'll help me get in the water. Who knows? But instead, Jesus tells him to get up and walk. So he's got to trust, okay, I'm worthy enough to try. I'm worthy enough to listen. I'm worthy enough to let this guy crash through barriers of shame. Maybe I am somebody. Maybe I can get up and walk. Maybe I can maybe I can do it. He has to make those decisions before he even listens to Jesus. And so this man dares to believe that he's worthy of walking. He dares to believe that he's worthy of somebody overcoming barriers of shame in his life. And in my experience, that has been the core choice in a healthy spirituality, one that leads to healing. I've prayed for all kinds of things. There's a prayer I've prayed that's always been answered. Always been answered. Never remember a time when it wasn't answered. Prayer is something like this. God, do you love me? And anytime I've read the Gospels, anytime I've reflected on the teaching of Jesus, the answer's always been yes. God, do you love me? Am I worthy? Am I somebody who's worthy to have shame removed from my life? Do I have value? Anytime I've read the Gospels, in the Hebrew Scripture too, the Old Testament, I've always gotten an answer. Always gotten an answer to that prayer. Yes, you're worthy. Yes, I love you. God loves people. People matter to God. And every human being has dignity and worth, and we want to do what leads to human flourishing. And you want to be led towards wholeness, and I want to do that for you. And so that's a prayer that's always been answered. And I found that if you're willing to open yourself up and say, I'm worthy of love. Shame does not have to define me. That's the beginning of healing. And that's what this TED Talk is about that I'm going to play here. And it's called The Power of Vulnerability. It's a great beginning place for curating a spiritual life, whatever customized way it might look for you. This is a great way to start because bad religion is shame-based. It builds barriers. It sends messages that you're not worthy, you're shameful. And that leads to closed-mindedness because you have to be closed. You can't be who you really are. And so you can't relate to other people. You can't be connected with other people. And then, of course, you have to look down on other people too because you look down on yourself. And you got to demonize those qualities that you don't like when you see them in other people too, not just yourself. You follow me? But there's a way of living that is better than that. So a person in our church sent me this link a few weeks ago. The Power of Vulnerability by Brene Brown. Brene Brown is a researcher storyteller on how to connect with each other. And her research led to a breakthrough in her own life, and that's what she shares in this TED Talk. I have to give this disclaimer in church. You guys, there's a 4-letter word in the video that I could have edited out, right? But I figured we're adults, and are we going to be okay with the 4-letter word? Are we going to be okay? 23% of you think we're going to be okay. Great, for the 4-letter, good. Okay, but there's such amazing content that it's worth it, even with the 4-letter word, okay? So I'm going to invite you to watch for about 18 minutes or so, and I'm going to have a seat and watch as well, and then I'll come up and make some closing comments. So I invite you to settle in. Take notes if you have something to take notes with, and here's the power of vulnerability.
So I'll start with this. A couple of years ago, an event planner called me because I was going to do a speaking event. And she called and she said, I'm really struggling with how to write about you on the little flyer. And I thought, well, what's the struggle? And she said, well, I saw you speak, and I'm going to call you a researcher, I think, but I'm afraid if I call you a researcher, no one will come because they'll think you're boring and irrelevant. And I was like, okay. And she said, but the thing I liked about your talk is, you're a storyteller, so I think what I'll do is just call you a storyteller. And of course, the academic, insecure part of me was like, you're going to call me a what? And she said, I'm going to call you a storyteller. And I was like, oh, why not Magic Pixie? I was like, let me think about this for a second. And so I tried to call deep on my courage. And I thought, I am a storyteller. I'm a qualitative researcher. I collect stories. That's what I do. And maybe stories are just data with a soul, and maybe I'm just a storyteller. So I said, you know what? Why don't you just say I'm a researcher storyteller? And she went, there's no such thing. So I'm a researcher or storyteller. And I'm going to talk to you today. We're talking about expanding perception. And so I want to talk to you and tell some stories about a piece of my research that fundamentally expanded my perception and really actually changed the way that I live and love and work and parent. And this is where my story starts. When I was a young researcher, doctoral student, my first year I had a research professor who said to us, here's the thing, if you cannot measure it, it does not exist. And I thought he was just sweet talking me. I was like, really? And he's like, absolutely. So you have to understand that I have a bachelor's in social work, a master's in social work, and I was getting my PhD in social work. So my entire academic career was surrounded by people who kind of believed in the life's messy, love it, and I'm more the life's messy, clean it up, organize it, and put it into a bento box. And so to think that I had found my way, to found a career that takes me, really one of the big sayings in social work is lean into the discomfort of the work. And I'm like, knock discomfort upside the head and move it over and get all A's. That was my mantra. So I was very excited about this. And so I thought, you know what? This is the career for me because I am interested in some messy topics, but I want to be able to make them not messy. I want to understand them. I want to hack into these things that I know are important and lay the code out for everyone to see. So where I started was with connection, because by the time you're a social worker for 10 years, what you realize is that connection is why we're here. It's what gives purpose and meaning to our lives. This is what it's all about. It doesn't matter whether you talk to people who work in social justice and mental health and abuse and neglect. What we know is that connection, the ability to feel connected, is neurobiologically, that's how we're wired. It's why we're here. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to start with connection. Well, you know that situation where you get an evaluation from your boss and she tells you 37 things that you do really awesome and one thing that you can't, an opportunity for growth. And all you can think about is that opportunity for growth, right? Well, apparently this is the way my work went as well, because when you ask people about love, they tell you about heartbreak. When you ask people about belonging, they'll tell you their most excruciating experiences of being excluded. And when you ask people about connection, the stories they told me were about disconnection. So very quickly, really about 6 weeks into this research, I ran into this unnamed thing that absolutely unraveled connection in a way that I didn't understand or had never seen. And so I pulled back out of the research and thought, I need to figure out what this is. And it turned out to be shame. And shame is really easily understood as the fear of disconnection. Is there something about me that if other people know it or see it, that I won't be worthy of connection? The things I can tell you about it, it's universal. We all have it. The only people who don't experience shame have no capacity for human empathy or connection. No one wants to talk about it, and the less you talk about it, the more you have it. What underpinned this shame, this I'm not good enough, which we all know that feeling, I'm not blank enough, I'm not thin enough, rich enough, beautiful enough, smart enough, promoted enough. The thing that underpinned this was excruciating vulnerability. This idea of, in order for connection to happen, we have to allow ourselves to be seen, really seen. And you know how I feel about vulnerability. I hate vulnerability. And so I thought, this is my chance to beat it back with my measuring stick. I'm going in, I'm going to figure this stuff out, I'm going to spend a year, I'm going to totally deconstruct shame, I'm going to understand how vulnerability works, and I'm going to outsmart it. So I was ready, and I was really excited. As you know, it's not going to turn out well. You know this. So I could tell you a lot about shame, but I'd have to borrow everyone else's time. But here's what I can tell you that it boils down to. And this may be one of the most important things that I've ever learned in the decade of doing this research. My 1 year has turned into 6 years, thousands of stories, hundreds of long interviews, focus groups. At one point, people were sending me journal pages and sending me their stories, thousands of pieces of data, and 6 years. And I kind of got a handle on it. I kind of understood this is what shame is, this is how it works. I wrote a book, I published a theory, but something was not okay. And what it was is that if I roughly took the people I interviewed and divided them into people who really have a sense of worthiness. That's what this comes down to, a sense of worthiness. They have a strong sense of love and belonging. And folks who struggle for it, and folks who are always wondering if they're good enough. There was only one variable that separated the people who have a strong sense of love and belonging and the people who really struggle for it, and that was the people who have a strong sense of love and belonging believe they're worthy of love and belonging. That's it. They believe they're worthy. And to me, the hard part of the one thing that keeps us out of connection is our fear that we're not worthy of connection, was something that personally and professionally I felt like I needed to understand better. So what I did is I took all of the interviews where I saw worthiness, where I saw people living that way, and just looked at those. What do these people have in common? And I have a slight office supply addiction, but that's another talk. So I had a manila notebook, a manila folder, and I had a Sharpie, and I was like, what am I going to call this research? And the first words that came to my mind were wholehearted. These are kind of wholehearted people living from this deep sense of worthiness. So I wrote at the top of the manila folder, and I started looking at the data. In fact, I did it first in this in a 4-day, very intensive data analysis where I went back, pulled these interviews, pulled the stories, pulled the incidents. What's the theme? What's the pattern? My husband left town with the kids because I always go into this kind of Jackson Pollock crazy thing where I'm just like writing and going and kind of just in my researcher mode. And so here's what I found. What they had in common was a sense of courage. And I want to separate courage and bravery for you for a minute. Courage, the original definition of courage, when it first came into the English language, it's from the Latin word cur, meaning heart. And the original definition was to tell the story of who you are with your whole heart. And so these folks had, very simply, the courage to be imperfect. They had the compassion to be kind to themselves first and then to others, because as it turns out, we can't practice compassion with other people if we can't treat ourselves kindly. And the last was they had connection, and this was the hard part, as a result of authenticity. They were willing to let go of who they thought they should be in order to be who they were, which is, you have to absolutely do that for connection. The other thing that they had in common was this. They fully embraced vulnerability. They believed that what made them vulnerable made them beautiful. They didn't talk about vulnerability being comfortable, nor did they really talk about it being excruciating, as I had heard earlier in the shame interviewing. They just talked about it being necessary. They talked about the willingness to say, I love you first. the willingness to do something where there are no guarantees, the willingness to breathe through waiting for the doctor to call after your mammogram, the willing to invest in a relationship that may or may not work out. They thought this was fundamental. I personally thought it was betrayal. I could not believe I had pledged allegiance to research, where our job, the definition of research is to control and predict, to study phenomenon for the explicit reason to control and predict. And now my mission to control and predict had turned up the answer that the way to live is with vulnerability and to stop controlling and predicting. This led to a little breakdown, which actually looked more like this. And it did. It led to I call it a breakdown, my therapist calls it a spiritual awakening. Spiritual awakening sounds better than breakdown, but I assure you it was a breakdown. And I had to put my data away and go find a therapist. Let me tell you something. You know who you are when you call your friends and say, I think I need to see somebody. Do you have any recommendations? Because about 5 of my friends are like, woo, I wouldn't want to be your therapist. And I was like, what does that mean? And they're like, I'm just saying, don't bring your measuring stick. It's like, okay. So I found a therapist. My first meeting with her, Diana, I brought in my list of the way the wholehearted live. And I sat down, and she said, how are you? And I said, I'm great, I'm okay. And she said, what's going on? And I said, and this is a therapist who sees therapists, because we have to go to those because their BS meters are good. And so I said, here's the thing, I'm struggling. And she said, what's the struggle? And I said, well, I have a vulnerability issue, and I know that vulnerability is kind of the core of shame and fear and our struggle for worthiness, but it appears that it's also the birthplace of joy, of creativity, of belonging, of love, and I think I have a problem, and I need some help. And I said, but here's the thing, no family stuff, no childhood shit, I just need some strategies. Thank you. So she goes like this. And then I said, it's bad, right? And she said, it's neither good nor bad. It just is what it is. And I said, oh my God, this is gonna suck. And it did, and it didn't. And it took about a year. And you know how there are people that, like, when they realize that vulnerability and tenderness are important, that they kind of surrender and walk into it? A, that's not me. And B, I don't even hang out with people like that. For me, it was a year-long street fight. It was a slugfest. Vulnerability pushed, I pushed back. I lost the fight, but probably won my life back. And so then I went back into the research and spent the next couple of years really trying to understand what the wholehearted, what the choices they were making, and what are we doing with vulnerability? Why do we struggle with it so much? Am I alone in struggling with vulnerability? No. So this is what I learned. We numb vulnerability. When we're waiting for the call, it was funny, I sent something out on Twitter and on Facebook that says, how would you define vulnerability? What makes you feel vulnerable? And within an hour and a half, I had 150 responses. Because I wanted to know, what's out there. Having to ask my husband for help because I'm sick and we're newly married. Initiating sex with my husband, initiating sex with my wife. Being turned down, asking someone out. Waiting for the doctor to call back, getting laid off, laying off people. This is the world we live in. We live in a vulnerable world. And And one of the ways we deal with it is we numb vulnerability. And I think there's evidence, and it's not the only reason this evidence exists, but I think that it's a huge cause. We are the most in debt, obese, addicted, and medicated adult cohort in US history. The problem is, and I learned this from the research, that you cannot selectively numb emotion. You can't say, here's the bad stuff. Here's vulnerability, here's grief, here's shame, here's fear, here's disappointment. I don't want to feel these. I'm going to have a couple of beers and a banana nut muffin. I don't want to feel these. And I know that's knowing laughter. I hack into your lives for a living. I know that's, God. You can't numb those hard feelings without numbing the other affects or emotions. You cannot selectively numb. So when we numb those, we numb joy. We numb gratitude. We numb happiness. And then we are miserable and we are looking for purpose and meaning. And then we feel vulnerable. So then we have a couple of beers and a banana nut muffin. And it becomes this dangerous cycle. One of the things that I think that we need to think about is why and how we numb. And it doesn't just have to be addiction. The other thing we do is we make everything that's uncertain certain. Religion has gone from a belief in faith and mystery to certainty. I'm right, you're wrong, shut up. That's it. Just certain. The more afraid we are, the more vulnerable we are, the more afraid we are. This is what politics looks like today. There's no discourse anymore. There's no conversation. There's just blame. You know how blame is described in the research? A way to discharge pain and discomfort. We perfect. If there's anyone who wants their life to look like this, it would be me. But it doesn't work, because what we do is we take fat from our butts and put it in our cheeks. Which just, I hope in 100 years people will look back and go, wow. You know. And we perfect, most dangerously, our children. Let me tell you what we think about children. They're hardwired for struggle when they get here. When you hold those perfect little babies in your hand, our job is not to say, look at her, she's perfect. My job is just to keep her perfect, make sure she makes the tennis team by 5th grade and Yale by 7th grade. That's not our job. Our job is to look and say, you know what? You're imperfect and you're wired for struggle, but you are worthy of love and belonging. That's our job. Show me a generation of kids raised like that and we'll end the problems I think that we see today. We pretend that what we do doesn't have an effect on people. We do that in our personal lives. We do that corporate, whether it's a bailout, an oil spill, a recall. We pretend like what we're doing doesn't have a huge impact on other people. I would say to companies, this is not our first rodeo, people. We just need you to be authentic and real and say, we're sorry, we'll fix it. But there's another way, and I'll leave you with this. This is what I have found. To let ourselves be seen, deeply seen, vulnerably seen. To love with our whole hearts, even though there's no guarantee. And that's really hard, and I can tell you as a parent, that's excruciatingly difficult. To practice gratitude and joy in those moments of kind of terror when we're wondering, can I love you this much? Can I believe in this passionately? Can I be this fierce about this? Just to be able to stop and instead of catastrophizing what might happen, to say, I'm just so grateful. Because to feel this vulnerable means I'm alive. And the last, which I think is probably the most important, is to believe that we're enough. Because when we work from a place, I believe, that says, I'm enough, then we stop screaming and start listening. We're kinder and gentler to the people around us, and we're kinder and gentler to ourselves. That's all I have. Thank you.
Helpful. So the woman at the well, the man at the pool of Bethesda, They were vulnerable, and they allowed themselves to be loved by Jesus. They allowed themselves to be touched by something that was bigger than the religious systems that really created barriers in their lives and that were shame-based, that has shamed them and told them they weren't worthy. And to be vulnerable is a great place to begin, cultivating your own healthy spiritual life.